So when I'm talking about all of these ways of manipulating photos, really you can listen to me or you don't have to. This is just some advice that I want to impart on you. But this is what works for me. And like I said before, anything that makes it faster to start processing these photos and get them out of your queue and up on the internet or out to your family is a good thing. Whatever you can do to get these out faster and so you can take more photos in the end, that's usually the goal. Or I guess if you want to spend time with your family, but who wants to do that? Okay, so the last piece of advice that I am going to hammer into you, and I really am going to hammer it into you, literally, I have a hammer in my backpack, is that you must back up. It is, if I could make a requirement for this class, I would, because backing up your data is so important. I have so many stories of data that I've backed up. Okay, so here's a good one. So I had a laptop with all that iView Media Pro photos that I mentioned to you, and an external hard drive, like pictured here, that I would plug into the machine and back up every day or every 12 hours or something like that. And I was thinking, okay, I'm set. I have a laptop with all my photos and a backup drive with all my photos. But guess what happened? One day I woke up, I went to turn on my computer, turned it on, the hard drive was dead. And I'm like, okay, it's a little nerve-wracking, but it's not so bad. I have a backup. But it turns out my backup was dead as well. So now, as a result, I did lose some photos. Not a lot. I did lose some photos, but it just was a fluke. And I remember going to the Apple store and because I had an Apple laptop and complaining to them that I needed a new hard drive because it had broken. And they told me, oh, there's no way that both of them could have broken at the same time. It's statistically impossible, but it actually did happen. And so you're playing with fire with hard drives. They're moving parts that are moving very, very quickly, and it's not something that you want to rely on just on having one hard drive. All of your data, all of your important bits of data, including your photos, if those are what are really important to you, you don't want to have them just on one hard drive or even just on 2 hard drives. I would tell you my backup scenario now, but I would embarrass myself with how many hard drives I have. Okay, it's 4. So back up your photos. It's not that expensive to do. Even 500 gigabytes will store a ton of photos, even your really important personal data, maybe even some emails, so on and so forth. And this is pretty cheap. You can even go to Best Buy or any local store and find some relatively cheap hardware to an external drive to store your photos. And if you're truly paranoid, you're going to do more than just store your photos on several external drives. You will also store them in completely different geographical locations as well. Yes, I do this as well. So the reason is that imagine, you know, God forbid, there's some really apocalyptic event in your home. So it burns down, it floods, something like that. It doesn't matter how many external drives you have, you're going to lose all of that data. And you can't store your computer in one of those big fire safes because then it will overheat. So you can't do, so you really, the only way to protect yourself is to have many copies of it in as many places as possible. So there's a variety of online backup solutions. Unfortunately, there's not a great one that I can really recommend right now for you to offload your files onto either the internet or even someplace else. Most of the time, using an offsite backup takes work. So that means you have to do something like, and what I did for a little while was I had 2 external hard drives. I had one plugged into my computer, and then I had one in my car, and I would swap them every so often. And that ended up not working very well because I would never do it, and the hard drive froze or something. So literally, because it was cold outside. So these are things, risks that you take when using the computer, and there's a lot of them in addition to just losing your data, but it's something that you should spend time trying to figure out. Yes? Are the fixed state flash drives more reliable? Theoretically, they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be more reliable from bumps and shocks and that sort of thing because the tolerances on these hard drives are very low. If you're not familiar, there's a spinning platter, and literally less than a hair's width away is a piece of metal that hovers over it, reading the data off of it. And if it gets bumped, then usually that piece of metal can gouge into the hard drive, and there goes some of your data. And so the solid-state drives, which do not have movable parts, are supposed to help with that, and they do have better shock resistance, but they still are prone to failures because they will wear out eventually. They'll have, electrical surges, that sort of thing can also cause them to fail. So they might be more reliable, but I don't have concrete data on that. But still, if you're using one, you should still back up your data. And in fact, it's harder to recover data from a solid-state drive than it is from a hard drive. So if you do have a failure, you're worse off. Okay. So using software tools, you can actually do quite a bit more than just organize your photos. You can also interact with a camera. And so even cameras that are 5 years old have the capability, or many of them have the capability to connect to a laptop computer via a USB cable, and you can control them using software. So using Aperture or using the software that came with your specific camera, you can usually fire the shutters. You can actually click the shutter from afar using your computer. And so I have to say that this sounds to be of limited use, and it is if you for particularly advanced setups, but if you want something that's easy, so for example, you have a studio setup where you need to take a lot of photos of something or someone, and neither your camera nor the computer is moving, this is a very good situation. It's a very good scenario because you can take a photo from your computer, it will automatically be downloaded, and you can see it on your computer right away and be able to make adjustments. And I guarantee that no matter how big the screen is on your camera, it's still not very big. And once you see the photo on your computer screen, it's going to look a little bit different than it did on your camera. Generally worse, because usually when you see it on a screen this big, you're like, wow, it looks so awesome. You remember chimping? Ooh, ooh, ooh. So usually when you bring it to a computer screen, which is much larger in comparison, then you can actually see what the photo looks like, and you may be disappointed. And so if you can have a live view of that photo just as it was taken, then you'll be able to make modifications to it and be able to retake the photo right away. And in fact, newer cameras even have the capability to display like a video feed of what they see over to the computer, so that you don't even have to take a photo, and it will show you exactly how the photo is framed and how it will look with that light. How it will differ is if you have flash, for example, if you have some strobes that fire and then it alters the light in some way. But still, that can be very useful, especially for taking a look at the focus, how well focused it is, if it's on a macro subject or a variety of things. And as much as I wish that this technology was available cheaply, it's not really possible yet to do all of this wirelessly. So, well, that's a bit of a white lie. It is possible to do, but it's just exorbitantly expensive to try to transfer or to be able to control your camera wirelessly for now. So if you were thinking that you would connect your camera to your computer and be able to take shots wirelessly so that you can do something crazy like attach your camera to the outside of your car and drive really fast and then take photos, you might have to think again, because you will have to string a long USB cable from the computer over to the camera in order to do that. There do exist so if this interests you, there do exist some piece of hardware, I think it's called iFi or something like that, where they're small SD cards, and most digital SLRs don't actually take SD cards, they take the larger compact flash cards. But if you have a compact digital camera, for example, it most likely takes an SD card. And that has, I believe, some of the iFi SD cards actually have Wi-Fi built into them, and they are, I think, somewhat reasonably priced for what they are, so that you can actually send those photos that you've taken over to your computer remotely or wirelessly once you've taken them. But usually you lose the ability to have that live view that I was talking about before, where you could actually see the screen, or you could actually see what your camera sensor sees on your computer screen while you're manipulating the settings. Okay, so one of the things that we will be talking about, and not really going over much today, but just introducing you to the fact, is that the benefits of RAW files over JPEG are quite numerous, and though there are some disadvantages as well, if you want the highest quality out of a photo, you will generally need to take that photo using the RAW format. And when you take a photo in the RAW format, because it is, as it sounds, sort of the raw data that's come out of the camera, you have a lot more options available to you in terms of manipulation of that photo. And not only do you have these standard sort of controls available to you as part of RAW processing, which include exposure, saturation, brightness, and contrast, but they actually, all of these become much higher quality to adjust when you are using the RAW format. And really, this is meant to be just a teaser, because when we're going over this stuff in future lectures, where right now we're really taking photos in JPEG mode and we don't have to take any in RAW mode, hopefully a lot of this stuff will become apparent. But using the software tools to process photos in RAW is actually, well, it's a mixed bag, because though it does provide you with the best quality output usually, it also takes some additional time for you to be able to process all of these photos. But one of the things that we can do now when we're talking about software tools is resizing and cropping. So this is actually something that you can do. Really, it doesn't matter how you take the photo or with which camera or even what software you use, but most of the time software will allow you to resize or crop the image. And this is a good thing, because most of these images that you take are very, very large. If they're 8 megapixels or 10 megapixels or so on and so forth, we're talking about 3,500 pixels wide by about 2,500 pixels down. And that's larger than just about all of your computer screens, unless you have an abnormally large computer screen just sitting at home. And so when you take these photos, if you were to crop them or resize them, you can actually make them a lot more manageable of a size for you to send not only to your friends and family over email, but also to Flickr, for example. And so if you keep, I think I'm a big fan of keeping the original sized photographs at 100% only available to yourself, and sending out slightly resized versions of those, because then it's a lot easier to prove who the original photo belongs to. If you have the original 100% version of that photo, then it's a lot easier for you to make an argument and say, look, I have this photo in its original resolution, I bet you don't. And you could go, you could combat any sort of copyright issues that you might be able to come across. Of course, it's not tested, but it might actually work, I think. And so, but it has the side benefit not only of that, but also, like I said, because we're dealing with monitors that are really quite small in size relative to the size of these images, resizing them down to maybe, let's say, 1,000 pixels wide by however tall it is usually a good way to go, because then that photo will still take up a good sizable portion of that user's desktop, may even take up the entire thing depending on the size of their monitor, but you are making it a lot more reasonable. However, when you are cropping a photo, one of the things that you have to be concerned with is how much resolution you have. And so one of the things that we'll be talking about throughout the semester is that you really don't need to concern yourself too much with megapixels. Just about every camera available on the market today has enough megapixels for pretty much whatever you need it to do. But where this does become useful is when you are cropping something, and specifically when you are cropping something a lot. So as you remember from the first lecture, we were talking about these files as being raster files, and what that means are bitmap files, and what that means is they're made up of pixels, or basically a matrix of small dots that have different colors, whose combination in the end makes up the original photo that we see here today. And when you really get down to it and zoom in on one of these photos quite a bit, or if you try to crop it by quite a lot, then part of the problem is that you could start to see some of these individual pixels, and you would get a problem, what we call pixelation. So like what you see here, and I apologize that the contrast is low, I still have to work on the lighting here, but you can see I've zoomed in quite a bit on a particular portion of this image, and you can see the individual blocks on some detail in this image. And well, it's kind of neat to look at. You don't want to do this all the time. So when you're cropping an image, you don't want to crop too much or risk resizing. And in fact, whenever you see some piece of software or anything on TV or in the movies that say enhance, and then magically you can see all of that detail that used to be there in real life but isn't there in the photo, it's a bunch of I can't say what I really think about it, but it is terrible. It's not right. You cannot actually create data where there was none. As you can see from this photo, this is as much data as we have from this particular section of the photograph. And your guess is actually probably better than a computer's as to what this thing is or what the details of this thing actually look like if you were to look at it at a much higher resolution. So resizing, if you're going to resize photos, it's okay to resize photos down to make them smaller, but you have to be really careful when you're resizing photos up and making them bigger, because you are risking pixelation, and no matter how good of a program you are using to resize these photos, you were going to get some weirdness, so if you'll let me use that term, out of a photo when you try to make it larger. You're not going to get additional detail out of it, you're just going to begin getting pixelation. Or good photos, or rather good pieces of software like Photoshop will try to use some tricks to try to make it look a little bit sharper, like make it look like it's gotten a little bit more detail. This doesn't work very well, and it's really only a band-aid for a huge gash in the problem of resizing a photo and making it much larger. So this is especially applicable to compact digital cameras that use digital zooms. So sometimes they have this ridiculous notion. This was very popular, especially a few years ago, where they would say, oh, we have 120x total zoom or something like that. And when you actually got down to it, you saw that it had 4x optical zoom and 80x digital zoom or something like that. And all it is doing, the digital zoom, is literally just resizing the photo to be bigger. It's just making it bigger and cropping it so that the end result is that it has the same number of pixels, but you have much less data, because it is as if you're taking a small portion from the middle of the frame and making it bigger and getting all of that pixelation and losing all of that data that existed before, and you're getting the same size file. It's just a waste for everybody. It's purely a marketing thing. It doesn't help you get any better resolution out of these photos. It doesn't help the camera resolve any additional detail that might have existed in the scene. If you have a camera that has both optical zoom and digital zoom, disable the digital zoom. It's really not doing you any favors, and you can do a higher quality digital zoom if you really want later on your computer. No matter what, the algorithms in your camera just are not as good as the ones that are in good programs such as Photoshop that are available on the computer. So turn off the digital zoom. It's just a waste of your time, and crop later if you really, really want to. And again, megapixels really aren't that important unless you're doing a lot of cropping. If you're doing a lot of cropping, so for example, people who take photos of birds, for example, usually need to get the longest lenses they possibly can, the biggest lenses they possibly can, and to get the most detail they possibly can to be able to crop these photos. And usually that means you will want to have a slightly higher megapixel camera. This comes at a certain expense though, and we'll talk about this throughout the semester, but usually having more megapixels is not always a good thing. So be wary of that when you're buying a digital camera. If you're looking at two and you're leaning towards one because it has slightly higher megapixels, don't worry about it. It really doesn't make that much of a difference. Look at all the other features that come with the camera instead. That is what will make the biggest difference to your photos.